Hello, Dr. Ripley here. Thanks for joining me to talk about population ecology. I'm going to start by defining what a population is and how scientists study them, which is called demography. Quick answer to what a population is that it's a semi-isolated group of individuals of the same species. And if you're thinking, Dr. That doesn't help me very much, we'll come back to that in the next slide and talk about it using an example so that you'll understand what that means. Real quickly, just looking at the image here, it's an aerial photo. And it's an example of how we can use that kind of technology from a drone taking pictures. Then we can use them and identify large herbivores like the animals that are in this image shown in the blue boxes. So we can count that there's 5 of these animals in our picture. So that's one example of how we can study them, just going out and counting them. It sounds easy enough to do, but it can be a challenge. All right, let's go back to the idea of what a population really is. All right, now I'm going to use this example. We're going to talk about caribou. There's a picture of one if you're not sure what they look like. Now, in North America, they're called caribou. They also live in Eurasia, and they're called reindeer over there, but they're actually the same species. They used to have a circum-Arctic distribution when the land bridge still existed between Alaska and Russia before the end of the last ice age. So we have this geographic separation now between the Eurasian reindeer and the North American caribou. Now, they still will interbreed if you move them together, but they're probably on their way to becoming different species because they're completely isolated from one another. Now, this map shows the Arctic tundra habitat where the caribou live, and it has the historic range, which extends down into these light brown areas all the way down into the US. And then the green and the dark brown areas show where they are currently living. Now, also shown are these dotted lines. Those surround areas or the geographic ranges of different herds of caribou. So, herds are large groups of individuals that stay together with one another based on behavior, and they're defined by scientists by the place where they go in the spring to have their babies and raise them for the first couple months. So these geographic locations, depending on what herd we're talking about, they're in Alaska, they can be very close to one another. But if we look at these other two populations, they're quite at a distance. And we don't really imagine that a caribou from the one that's highlighted in yellow is going to be strolling across over to Alaska and end up mingling with one of the populations over there. So we see from their geographic distances that even though they're all caribou, they're of the same species, that the species is spread out to the point that some of these groups are going to not really interact with the others, right? So there's subgroupings within the species, and we're going to call them populations. Now, we can have populations that are close to one another, that most of the time they stay separate, but then occasionally individuals will move from one population to the other. And those two populations that are close together and have some mixing will be more similar to one another than the ones that are further away and have less mixing. Okay, so this idea of populations being semi-isolated from one another means that there's limited migration in between them. To give you some words to write down in your notes, hopefully based on this explanation, it makes more sense. But the next slide has our formal definition. So species are divided into populations. So populations are subgroups within species. It's a semi-isolated group of individuals of the same species. When we look at those individuals that are in the same population, we're going to see that they're located in the same general environment, so they could possibly wander around, bump into one another. That means they're also potential breeding partners with one another. But each population may form a distinct grouping within the species. So we might see observable characteristics that are different between populations, such as color patterns, size. And we may be able to detect genetic differences that aren't observable from the outside. So these populations are somewhat separated or isolated from other populations. What they aren't is well mixed. All right. So if we have a group of individuals of the same species that are mixing completely together with one another, they're all in the same population, is another way to think about it. Now that separation can be very extreme, have almost no individuals that ever move in between them, or they can be not very separated. They can have quite a few individuals moving between. So we're going to count the individuals that migrate between the population, and that's going to be how we're going to measure this separation. All right, let's turn back to how do we study populations? Now, when I was growing up, part of how I fell in love with biology was watching the TV show Wild Kingdom. And it always seemed like Marlon Perkins and Jim were bouncing around in some beat up Land Rover that would probably get a flat tire or break down. And they were trying to lasso a giraffe or shoot a tranquilizer dart into a cheetah so that they could um, put some kind of number tag on it, and also perhaps fit it with, back in the day, a radio collar. Now, technology has changed, improved a lot. There's even a reboot of Wild Kingdom showing some of that with a fantastic new host, Dr. Raywin Grant. So you should check that out. And um, although, sorry, capturing and marking or tagging individuals has is still a bedrock of population ecology, but we have really tiny little tags that can also log other information like GPS position and maybe even air or water temperature. We also can use drones to take photographs. So instead of flying over the population in a helicopter, research teams can use a drone. They can buy a Walmart practically to collect the same kind of information. And these improvements are great. Um, there's less disruption to the animals. The scientists are safer, they're cheaper, so more surveys can be done. Let's look at some examples of what a population ecologist might be doing on a day-to-day basis. Now, they do spend a lot of time in the lab putting data into their computer, even doing quite a bit of math and maybe computer programming, but they still have to collect their data out in the field. So collecting, counting, marking, tagging, recovering are still going to be things that scientists have to do one animal at a time. For example, on the far left, this young scientist is using the pliers to crimp a little metal ID bracelet around the ankle of that bird. So the birds are caught in nests, and then these ID bands are put on their ankles. And so scientists in different countries across the globe, depending on how far these birds migrate, can identify the exact same individual. We may be freshwater ecologists out scooping up fish or invertebrates in a net. Oceanographic population ecologists may be making those samples from boats. And if you're a plant biologist, people study plants too. You may be able to walk around, measure the individuals, but for example, you may also collect soil samples to look for seeds that are in them, perhaps after a fire, like in this case, where you could see what effect the fire had on what seeds were still living in the soil. And finally, sometimes scientists have to scoop poop and other kinds of biological evidence that we can find in nature. There are cells from the animal's body mixed in with the waste, and so we can use DNA fingerprinting technology to actually ID individuals from their scat. So we don't have to catch and tranquilizer dart that bear. We can tell which bear it was by identifying its DNA from its poop. All right. So, with all of these types of data analysis, we can eventually collect together that information, analyze it, see what it tells us. And we're going to use this example of mountain lions. There's a mountain lion or a puma there with the Hollywood sign behind him. That's P22. And so, decades of work scientists have done to track the locations of mountain lion population around Los Angeles. So, I want you to look at this figure, look at the figure key, and think about what are a couple conclusions you can draw from looking at this figure. And pause the video so that you have a few minutes to think about it. When you come back, we'll compare notes. All right, we'll see how you do. All right. So, what I see looking at this figure and using the legend is that there's a fairly small population across this region. There's only 12 animals marked, and it may not be every single one, but that's a pretty small number of individuals. That the territory sizes are enormous. There's a scale across the bottom there. You can use it to see that territories are from 5 to 20 or even larger miles across. The males have larger territories than the females in general, and that most of them don't overlap, but the males' territories often include more than one female's. We can also see that the habitat they use is mostly natural habitat, but it does come down into the edges of urban neighborhoods. So there's the potential for human wildlife conflict in these areas, although the mountain lions typically don't interact with humans unless they're old or injured. And that happened with this animal P22 when he got really old and possibly sick, injured. He was starting to attack people's dogs, and so he was captured and had to be euthanized. But look at how tiny his territory is compared to all the other mountain lions. He still lived to the ripe old age, 25, and was mourned by the Los Angeles area community because he was a celebrity basically that would pop up every now and then, and so people knew about P22. All right, that wraps up our video for today.